I'm live. Today we're going to talk about information, what you need, where you need or where to get it, and where you should put it. So, as always, you have questions, drop them in the comments, and we will get to them hopefully at the end of this live. I do want to congratulate everyone. You did a good job on your questions today. So all the ones we got ahead of time, excellent job, and we will get to all those. So in terms of gauges, there are really two main factors to think about when you are looking at whether you need gauges and what gauges you need. And those are basically what kind of upgrades have you done to the car. If you did new sway bars, you don't really need you don't need gauges to keep track of that. But if you did a turbo kit or a supercharger kit, or particularly a big power kit or a kit that's not completely tuned to start off with, then you need gauges. And those gauges are kind of going to be in the tuning category of gauges. If you're doing a lot of track use, then you need what I would call warning kind of gauges. So that's temperature kind of stuff. So for tuning kind of stuff, typically you would want a boost gauge so that you know what kind of boost you're running. With a supercharger, depending on the kind of supercharger, that's a little less important because it's not physically possible to change the boost outside of air density or pulley sizes. With a turbo, that's a little easier to change, so that's something you need to pay a little bit closer attention to. A wideband is typically a good idea. Now, with something like our Stage 1 turbo kit, it's pre-tuned. There is no calibration that is possible on it. So this is more of a safety check that something else hasn't gone wrong than a tuning thing, but still not a bad idea. I'm not going to say it's absolutely necessary, but certainly not a bad idea. If you've got a standalone ECU, yeah, you definitely want a wideband so that the computer can read off of that, and you may or may not want to look at that data as you're driving down the road. For track use, usually the warning means temperature, so water temp, oil temp. Now, the water temp and the stock gauge is a big thing. The stock gauge does have a big dead spot in it, so it's not quite as bad as the internet has decided it is, but it's also not ideal. So basically, it shows what the temperature is, and then it comes up, and it stays in a single position. And I believe this is for all generations, maybe less on the ND, particularly the ND2. But anyway, so it comes up to what Mazda considers a normal operating temperature, and it stays in that exact same position for the entire normal operating range. So the bad news is you can't see if it's starting to get hotter and hotter and hotter. The good news is if it actually gets hot to the point where you need to be concerned, it'll still show you that. So if it doesn't give you much warning, but it does still show you when things are going wrong. So kind of pros and cons on that one. Oil pressure, the first 5 years of Miatas had a real oil pressure gauge. It tells you the real pressure reading. The rest of them were kind of an idiot light turned into a gauge. The NBs were just, do you have oil pressure? I believe it's 9 PSI, yes or no. That's all it says. On the NC, it's kind of similar but correlated to engine RPM. So it moves like a real oil pressure gauge, but it's really just an on-off switch combined with engine RPM to make it look like it's a real gauge, even though it is not actually a real gauge. But still, do you have oil pressure? Yes or no. It will tell you that. So that's kind of an overview. We'll get into some more specifics a little bit later. But one of the big questions is where to put it. So we're going to show you some options. So we've got our car here. So we have, Travis, if you want to swing around there, I guess. So we've got our A-pillar gauge here. So we have this in single or dual, and an attachment on top of the existing A-pillar, or a complete replacement for the A-pillar. These are nice because it's an easy install, it's very visible, it's easy to see. They're less nice because sometimes people don't like the aesthetics of them. Sometimes they can stick a little too far into your field of vision. That's why I like the single piece gauge pods there, where it replaces this. And basically what that means is it sucks the gauges in a little closer to the A-pillar. So they're still very, very visible, but less immediately in your field of vision, if that makes sense. We also have our vent gauge pod right here. So that's just a simple and inexpensive 3D printed piece that slips into your vent hole and has a perfect fit for a gauge on it. So this is a fail-safe gauge. Anyway, this is one that we just put in kind of temporarily to show off for this car. This car, we've got boost here, and then we've got air fuel here. So these are both what I would call kind of tuning gauges. So we can go over to my car. I will own up to this being my car, and that's why it's filthy. So apologies mostly to Travis on this one. But you can see, so this is this single piece A-pillar. So it's a little lower profile. The gauges are tucked in a little closer. It's not really an A to B because that's an NB2 and this is an NA, but similar-ish. So what and I also actually have gauges in the glove box there. So those are what I'm calling my tuning gauges, and these, or at least this, is my warning gauge. So this is my oil and water temperature, 2 in 1. I think that was a question. So this is a Westat gauge that we used to sell forever ago. I think this gauge is 25 years old, but it is still working well. So, and it's convenient because, basically if the needles are horizontal, it's in the right range, and that's kind of all I need to know, and it's easy to see at a glance. If the needles are up at the top, then I've got a problem that I need to start paying attention to. And then, wideband's kind of more tuning, but the single piece is only available in the dual gauge pod. So, and then over here, I have boost. So boost can be a warning thing, but my boost, I do have a standalone ECU in here, and it has overboost protection. So I have a high degree of confidence that if something goes wrong with my boost control system, the ECU will pull fuel before it blows up the engine. So the boost gauge is more kind of tuning than warning, if that makes sense. And that's a water pressure gauge on there that we were using for some testing stuff. So, and then we have the iDash here. So mounting wise, this is a suction cup gauge mount. So this will work on any car, of course, as long as you have a flat surface, such as a windshield, to put it on. So it actually is more discreet than I initially thought it would be. I really like it here. It works pretty well. It's kind of like an A-pillar gauge pod. So one of the things I like about the iDash, so we'll start talking about specific gauges. So the iDash gives you a ton of different information, but it does it in easy, in multiple different ways. We're not going to turn this into an iDash commercial, but basically I can set up, my tuning gauges here, for example, and I can go to another screen, and these are my warning gauges, if you will, like for track use. So, and I don't know, these are EGT. This is all tuning stuff because this is our development car for the NC Turbo Kit. But let's imagine that that's what we're doing. And you can also set up alerts. So if this value goes outside of this range, tell me about it. So that's kind of nice because instead of having to constantly watch your gauges, you just watch to see if it's freaking out. And if it is, something is wrong, and now you can pay attention to it. On track, you're not watching your gauges constantly. You're glancing at them very quickly to see, is it safe? Is it not safe? That's really all you want to know, generally speaking, when you're on track and focusing on other things. So yeah, in terms of specific gauges, again, we've got the wideband in that one. We've got the 2 temp gauge, which is very convenient for temperature right there. Oil pressure is one that a lot of people will add. if your car doesn't have it, that's kind of, your car's going to tell you if you have no oil pressure, but how much oil pressure is more of a kind of health of the engine. So if you suspect that there's something wrong with your engine, or if you just really want to keep a super close eye on it, oil pressure is a good one. Outside of that, oil pressure is kind of superfluous. You want to know whether you have oil pressure or not. That is by far the most important thing. And another pretty fancy way that we are coming out with here pretty soon to keep an eye on all of this is our analog race dash. So this is going to work with your stock gauges. This will work with a stock ECU, a standalone ECU, an engine swap, all sorts of stuff. And the code is going to be open source so that you can play with it and set it up, which once you do that and you start adding additional modules, it has a huge amount of information that it can display through these LEDs here. But pre-programmed, it is an LED tack, so it's going to show you easily what, basically what RPM you are at with a lighted, obvious indication as opposed to the needle. It's going to show you temperature. So this, there's a bunch of different traces in here, but short version. So that's cold coolant that's warming up. Okay, now it's fully warm. Okay, now it's getting hot, hotter, hotter, hotter. Okay, you have a problem. It's really hot. Now it's cooling back down. So short version, it'll tell you through the lights the safe, not safe on your coolant temp. It'll do that for oil pressure, and it's a low fuel light as well, because it takes all of that stuff. It basically translates everything that's in the cluster into lights on the gauges there. So that's a pretty surface level. We could go wildly in depth on a lot of specific things, and that's what the comments are for if you guys want to. But short version, that's kind of an overview. So let's get to your questions, because again, you guys did have some good ones. Okay, is an A-pillar gauge setup the best option in a Miata? Really, that's personal preference. I do like an A-pillar gauge because I find that it doesn't interfere with my vision that much. The aesthetics of it don't bother me, and it is very easy to see. So when I'm on track, I can just flick my eyes over, immediately see what the temps are, and then bring my eyes back to the track. That said, it's a lot of personal preference. The glove box is great because it's out of the way and it's not ugly, but it's terrible for actually being able to see it. So that's kind of a hard no on the track. There are panels underneath the radio that you can use that are pretty cool, but that's kind of a long way for your eye to travel when you're going really fast on track to see what your gauges are showing. The vent pod is kind of a nice in-between, because your eye has to travel farther than the A-pillar, but not really far. So it's kind of a good in-between. So the really short version, personal preference, whatever you like. Where should you be measuring oil temp, oil pressure, coolant temp for the gauges? So oil temp, a lot of it comes down to what's easiest. Oftentimes we will drill and tap the oil pan, or you can use you might be able to use a sandwich plate between the block and the oil filter. It kind of depends on how much space and what your stack up is and all that kind of stuff, but lots of times that's an option as well. Oil pressure, that's going to come off of, that could come off of a few different places, but the easiest one generally is going to be probably where the stock oil pressure sensor is to start off with. Bear in mind that the stock one is typically, unless we're talking about a real gauge, it's just a really small switch. It's just physically, the footprint of that sensor is very small. If you have a real oil pressure gauge that's going to give you an actual number, it's physically much bigger. They're maybe that big around. So you have to make sure that you have that real estate available. So you can take that off of, again, just use a T, kind of like we do for the oil supply on the NAs and NBs, and NC actually. So you can use that for a location for the oil pressure, or a sandwich plate underneath the oil filter is also a good option. Don't put it in your oil pan or you will be terrified because you never have any oil pressure, which is totally fine in your oil pan. Coolant temp. There are a lot of different options for coolant temps. There are hose splices. Our coolant reroute body has an extra spot in it for a temp sensor. My caution there would be to make sure that you put it in the hottest place. So unless you're trying to do like diagnosis and how effective is my radiator and that kind of thing, if you have a single water temp gauge, you want it to be in the hottest place. So don't put it on the water pump inlet that's measuring the temperature of the coolant that's coming out of your radiator, your heat exchanger, at its coolest point. You want a worst case scenario, so you want it at the, well, either the back or the front of the head, depending on whether you have a reroute, but short version, just before it comes into the radiator, basically. So hose splice in your upper radiator hose is great. The rear, the actual reroute body is a good choice there. The thermostat block-off plate, we do have a port for a temp sensor there. That's an okay place to put it, but that's going to be kind of warmish as opposed to hot and worst case for a few different reasons. So you want to have worst case for your coolant temp. Hopefully that answers that question. Okay, what does the stock Miata provide in terms of gauges? Are they accurate? Do different gens tell you different things? So I kind of covered this. The short version is the water temp has a big dead spot in it, but it is going to tell you if you're overheating. With the exception of the first few years, the oil pressure gauge is really just an idiot light turned into a gauge. So it's going to tell you, do I have oil pressure? Do I not have oil pressure? So is it safe to drive my car, or yes or no? It'll tell you that, at least in terms of oil pressure in the engine. How healthy is my engine? What kind of oil pressure does it generate? And it's not going to tell you that. And across the generations, that's true on the NAs and the NBs. On the NC, again, it's basically the same thing, but the computer puts RPM into the equation, so it moves like it's a real gauge, even though it's actually not. On the ND, I actually can't remember if they have, I don't think they have an oil pressure gauge. I think it's literally just a yes-no light. And then coolant. Coolant is kind of the same way. I believe the NC has a dead spot. And actually, I think they all have dead spots. The exact size might be a little bit different, but again, they all tell you whether you're overheating or not. So, okay, where does FM like to put coolant, oil, and oil pressure gauges? Again, for me, I would put like an oil pressure gauge probably in my glove box or in my vent pod or something like that, because that's just is my engine healthy or not? I'm going to rely on my stock gauges to say, do I need to shut my engine off right now because I don't have any oil pressure? Coolant and oil, that's a warning thing. That's a thing, and I'm talking track use here. Well, I guess every use, but mostly track. So that's something I would want to have more visible, probably an A-pill or something like that. There's a ton of personal preference in there. So, okay, what are your thoughts on ECU limits / warnings / flashing digital gauges versus a standard analog gauge? I really like the obvious, kind of like this guy, gauge if we're talking warning gauges for track use, and even kind of for street use, because you're less likely to pay attention to a needle that's just moving around a little bit, and you're more likely to pay attention to a giant light that's saying, hey, you really need to pay attention, something is going terribly wrong right now. So that's why I really like this, and I really like the iDash for that kind of thing. You don't have to always pay attention to it, because it's going to make itself known if there is a problem. From more of a tuning standpoint, the analog gauge is going to tell you exactly where it is. The iDash will also tell you that this, not really. So, again, kind of depends. What are the bare minimum useful gauges for a track car? I mean, really, bare minimum? Stock gauges. If it's a naturally aspirated car, you're probably fine with that. Just pay attention to them. If we're going to go, a little more, I would like to see coolant temp, so that you have a better idea of whether stuff is about to go wrong or how close you are to it going wrong. Oil temp is a really, really good one for forced induction cars, particularly turbo cars. For non-turbo cars, it's a little less critical. Basically, oil can deal with a much higher temperature than coolant can. So you're much less likely to overheat your oil, particularly on a naturally aspirated car, because you kind of have a lot more headroom there. But if it's a forced induction car, again, particularly a turbo car, now your likelihood of overheating your oil is quite a bit higher. So I would put that a little bit higher on the list. That's probably about it. You know, a wideband, it's informational, but you know, if the car is running that lean, you're going to feel it. So as long as you're paying attention, you say, "Hey, I just lost 30 horsepower. What's going on?" You'll know something is wrong. So do I need an AFR gauge on my supercharged NA8? It all depends on your engine management. So if you have a high degree of confidence in your engine management and it is not adjustable, then you probably don't necessarily need it. It is a good safeguard just to kind of know that everything is going right. So I still like it, but it's probably one that I would put in the glove box kind of thing, you know, unless you like the aesthetics of gauges, which is fine. If you have a standalone ECU or if you have a piggyback that's adjustable or something like that, then I would definitely have an AFR gauge in there. And again, with a standalone, maybe not again, but with a standalone, you want that wideband to feed its data into the ECU so that the ECU is going to run closed loop and is constantly adjusting your fueling based on what that wideband is saying, as opposed to the narrow band that the stock ECU runs on. And I'm not going to go into the depths of that because that's not what this conversation is for. But basically, you want the ECU to be running closed loop on that, and then the gauge is kind of going to be secondary so that you can double check things, which may be a very good idea based on your engine management. Hopefully that answers that question. With the vent gauge, what happens to the air that is supposed to come out of the vent? It comes out of the other vents. If you want an experiment, put your hand over one vent, see what happens to the other vents. Exact same thing. There's really not very much room for air to come out around the side of it. So you're not losing, well, you're just losing that vent kind of regardless of what you do there. So anyway, short version, use the other vent. Do you have any tips or tricks to help route cleanup wiring for gauges? I'm currently running 3 and it's messy. Excuse me. So that's going to be a really specific situational question. Arguably should have been skipped, frankly. I will say that I really like the woven loom. And if you take stuff apart a little more, then it's going to make it easier to run that wiring. Fish tape can also help you. That's kind of a rigid, you know, a fiberglass pole, like kind of super miniature tent pole, or a piece of steel that's really thin but kind of flexible. You can jam that up, attach your wires to that, pull it back down, or you know, whatever happens to vaguely match that description in your garage, and you can route your wires more cleanly that way. So those are a couple of, you know, super surface level hints on that. Favorite ideas for creative gauge placement? I mean, I think I kind of went over it. I wouldn't call the A-pillar placement creative, but I do like it. I actually really like the glove box idea for gauges that you need for tuning and not for normal use. Fun fact that's not at all related, the European glove boxes are a completely different shape than the US glove boxes, which is why I have that in my car that was supposed to be a U-Design product and didn't happen because the shape was not even close. So that one has been hacked up quite a bit to make it fit, but that's a great idea. If anybody wants to model that for us and take advantage of our U-Design program, please do. So yeah, otherwise, I mean, the Tombstone can be a good spot. They're back in the day, I don't even know if they're still available. They were kind of extensions, you know, top hats to the Tombstone, if you will. I wasn't a huge fan of those because they look a little clumsy and they're kind of in my field of view, but they're also not terrible. Whatever, there's a lot of personal preference in there for sure. Okay, some of these questions are a little repetitive. What gauges would be useful for my naturally aspirated NB2? It all depends on what kind of use you're putting it through. If it's street, whatever you want. If it's track, an actual coolant temp gauge, but again, that one's still going to tell you if you're overheating. It's just not going to tell you anything ahead of that. So, most important single gauge to have for non-boosted and boosted, I would probably go with coolant temp for non-boosted, well, for both of them, and then I would probably add oil temp for boosted Miatas. So hopefully that answers that. Can we have an oil temp and pressure gauge? Yes, so Westac, who makes the gauges, or the dual gauge that's in my car, they do make an oil pressure and oil temperature gauge in a single format with the needles that kind of do this as well. So they're not quite as clean. They don't look quite as nice as like an autometer or an AEM or something, but they do function well. So there's that. Okay, and that is the list of questions that I had ahead of time. There's been a lot of whispering in the corner there. So do we have any new questions?
Yes.
All right.
So let's start towards the top.
Ooh, there's a list. Excellent.
You kind of talked about brands, but are there any brands that we really prefer? Start there. I've got more.
Okay.
So.
Yeah, okay, we're starting there. So preferred brands. AEM makes a really good gauge. Autometer makes a good gauge. And Westac, the aesthetics are fine, but the functionality is pretty nice in that you can put two gauges in one. So I do kind of like that idea. That is not an exhaustive list. There are tons of other manufacturers out there, but those are kind of the ones that we have the most familiarity with and have worked well for us in the past. Next.
So would you put a dollar amount on budget for gauges, especially for track day or for track use?
Would I put a dollar amount on budget or gauges for a budget track day setup?
No, just like if you're going to go to the track, what would be your budget be on gauges?
What would my budget be on gauges for a track setup? I mean, the world is your oyster, but a couple $100 would probably get you pretty well set up with everything you need. Gauges generally aren't that expensive. The iDash is a little more expensive because it's got a huge amount of capability. Also on the iDash, it is only for the NC and the ND. It is an OBD2 gauge. It does not, basically that car is OBD2 and it's a real basic OBD2 that's not going to give you a whole lot. So the iDash actually won't pull anything out of that one. So yeah, the iDash is going to be a little bit more expensive and will give you a ton in one package. But yeah, generally speaking, figure a couple $100 and that's pretty comfy for gauges.
Pros and cons. If you are a later NA or NB owner and you want to have a real pressure gauge, what about putting in the earlier pressure sender versus just running an aftermarket oil pressure gauge?
Okay, so I want a real pressure gauge in my NA or NB that doesn't have a real oil pressure gauge. What's the best way to do it? So for an NA, if you can find the parts, it's pretty easy. And that's actually what I did in that one because that's a 96, but it has a real oil pressure gauge because I stole it out of my 94. So you replace the gauge in the cluster, you replace the sender on the engine, and you're done. Easy. On the NBs, I'm actually not sure, but I'm going to guess it's quite a bit more complicated because the cluster is pretty much completely different. So it really depends on your level of commitment. If you are very DIY, maybe you go to 3D printing and fabrication and electronics and that kind of stuff, you can probably make it work. If you want the information and you don't want to spend a wild amount of time on it, or that's not in your skill set, then I would do an aftermarket oil pressure gauge. It's going to be a much easier solution, but it's not going to be as clean of a solution, if that makes sense.
If you had to pick one gauge
to rule them all,
what would you do, especially for track use?
So if I had to pick one gauge for track use, it would be my coolant temp. Generally speaking, that is the most likely one to be, that's the most likely parameter to go out of range. You're more likely to overheat your coolant than anything else, if we're going to wildly generalize stuff. This car, now I will kind of slightly contradict myself there. My car, combo track and street car, I had it on track the other weekend. Now it has our reroute and our crossflow and our stage 2 brushless fan, and the coolant temps were rock solid, double stinted, no issues whatsoever. However, it does not have an oil cooler, and the oil temps were not out of range, but they were at the top of it. So that is kind of a contradiction to what I just said, because I've got a lot of cooling upgrades for the coolant on that car, but I don't have any upgrades for the oil cooling on that car. So now I would almost say that my oil temp is more important on that car than coolant, because coolant is being regulated pretty well with all of my upgrades, but oil is not, if that makes sense. So it's kind of situational. But if we're just going to apply a blanket overall, naturally aspirated, turbo, whatever, let's go coolant temp.
Reminder that that fancy new gauge set can be programmed to do all of these things as long as you have the right sensors.
Yeah. So like Mike said, if you're willing to add sensors to this setup and do a little bit of very easy programming, then this will do anything: oil pressure, oil temperature, boost level, air fuel ratio. I mean, this really is wildly capable, as long as you're able to add additional sensors to it and do the programming to kind of back that up. So that's it.
For right now.
For right now. Okay, good enough. Well, if you have more questions, we will answer those in the comments. All right, as always, thank you very much for stopping by. We're here every Thursday at 2 o'clock Mountain Time, so be sure to put it on your schedule, set alarms and reminders so you don't miss out on an FM Live, even though we do publish them afterwards if you do happen to miss them. So if you have ideas for other videos, drop them in the comments. Let us know. Be sure to follow, like, comment, subscribe, all the socially things, and we will see you next week. Thanks, everybody.